In this first video, we're going to take a look at how we create the height map for this material. So I've gone up and just created a new substance under my new template for our graph templates, and I created that in a previous tutorial, so the link will be in the description. I've just named our graph Sand Rocks, made sure the size is relative to parent, and I'm working in a 2K resolution. So over here we've got our pretty much our project startup template. And the way I want to start this project is by creating the rocks or the pebbles. So I'm going to start by creating a cells 2 node. And this is going to give us a bunch of these cells and all this noise. And I'm just going to plug this into our range and our normal here. And we're not going to see anything show up because we have to view our base material here in the output. So I'm going to right click this guy and go view in 3D. Alternatively, you can just right click and drag and hold and then drop that into your 3D view there. I also want to be able to take full advantage of our height map because right now we're not going to be able to see any of the height information. So I'm going to go up to materials, go to default and edit. And you can see over in your properties here, we've got our height tab and we have scale. And when I scale this up, we're going to be able to see our height on our mesh here. I'm going to go ahead and just bring this cells 2 back because we're going to use this for the base of our pebbles or our rocks. And so right now I feel like there's a little bit too much variation, or there's too many. It's still a little too noisy. So I'm going to go into our cells 2 and I'm just going to dial back the scale to something like 12. So we get a little bit larger cells here. I'm also going to decrease the edge width just so we get them a little bit sharper. If we double click here to see, that should be pretty good. So the next thing I want to do is I want to add a bevel node because I want to round the edges of these cells because right now they're pretty flat and they don't really look like stones. So I'm going to add a bevel, and by default the bevel is not going to input into our nodes over here, so I'm going to just shift and left click to steal this output and bring that into the height. And so with that, what we get is a pretty blown out value here, and you can see that it's pretty much almost flattened our image. So I'm going to bring the distance way down, and in fact I'm actually going to take our value into the negatives because with the distance, when it's in the positives, it's going to basically extrude the bevel value from the initial segment here, but when we bring it into negatives, it's going to start to peel it away from the initial value. You can see this is our outline here, and so it takes that and then gradiates it inwards. So we're going to go with about we can go about 0.04, so negative 0.04 there. I'm also going to take the smoothing amount, and this is just going to help blend the gradient. And you can see here when I crank this up, it's just going to smooth everything out. I'm going to bring that right up to 5. So we're starting to get something that resembles a little bit more like stones, but we're not quite there yet. You can see too with our bevel node, we get a lot of this banding effect. So what I want to do is I'm just going to add a blur high quality grayscale into the mix here. Again, stealing this output and plugging that in. And that's a little bit too noisy. So I'm going to first bring up the quality and then really decrease the intensity. I'll do something like 2. And that should be okay. We just want to make sure that we're getting rid of any of that banding effect. And that's looking pretty cool. I'm going to bring these guys back a little bit. And the next thing I want to do is I want to only select a few of these rocks and I want to eliminate the other ones, kind of like we're masking them off. So the way that we can do that is we can use a histogram scan node, and this is just going to scan through all of the different color values. And this is going to enable us to kind of select and mask off a few rocks. And you can see once I bump up the position here, we slowly start to reveal all of the rocks that we have until I bring it all the way up, and then we just get pure white again. So if I peel this back down, you can see what it's doing is it's just cycling through the values that we've inputted, and because there's different grayscale values, it's going to be able to actually select them separately as opposed to just showing them all at once. We can also increase the contrast. If we take a look here, bumping up the contrast really kind of removes the effect that we just tried to get with the bevel and the blur. So we want to use that pretty sparingly. I'm going to bump that down to a pretty low value. So now it's really up to how many rocks that you want to be present on your material. I'm going to bring that down a little bit. And I can even come back to my cells here and I can just change the disorder to get a different array of rocks. That looks pretty cool. So next, I want to go ahead and just rewarp these a little bit, just to give a little bit more variety in the shape of these rocks. So I'm going to add a warp node onto this. And I'm going to take a Gaussian noise and plug that guy in. And immediately it's going to mess everything up because we've got a pretty high intensity for such small scale noise. So I'm going to crank back the scale and play around with the disorder as well. And it's going to be a very subtle effect. I don't want it to completely rework our rocks, just to add a little bit more of a bulge and a warp in certain areas. And let's see, we can maybe even play around with the disorder. Just a subtle change like that. Now the problem with our warp, you can see here, is it starts again to add that graininess factor to it. So what I'm going to do is add another blur, high quality grayscale, bump up the quality, and I'm going to really just decrease the intensity again, just so that we can get rid of that little graininess. And now the last thing I want to do is I'm going to add a levels node, because I want to sharpen up the contrast just a little bit on the edges of these, and I also want to decrease their grayscale value range so that they're a little bit flatter and not as tall if we look up here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to crank up the black input, and that's going to just sharpen around the edges here. You can see if I dial that back, just going to sharpen things up very slightly. And I also want to crank our white output down, just so that we get the rocks a little bit flatter and not as tall. And you can see what it's done is it's taken the white value of our texture here, and it's just basically lowered the cap value so that the highest possible value is this kind of mid-gray. So we just completed our larger rocks, and I'm going to do the same process to get a little bit smaller, more varied looking rocks. I'm going to bring these guys back. I'm just going to hit Control D with all of them selected. I'm going to bring them up over top. And so all we have to do is we can come back to our cells. We can increase the scale to make them a little bit smaller. Come into our blur here, make sure to dial back the intensity just a little bit. And even come back into our bevel. to make sure that we can get a clear cut between our rocks here. Now taking a look, maybe decreasing the intensity on that a little bit more. Coming into our histogram, we just want to reshift the position just so we can get some rocks. Again, warping them. Taking a look at the blur as well. And for this one here, we can crank up the white output just a little bit and decrease the black. So now I want to blend these two together, and I'm going to use a height blend. And so I want to make sure to plug our large rocks into the height bottom here, and I'm going to take our top rocks and plug it into the height top. And you can see now we're going to get our rocks showing up, and if I snag this output here, we can see what it's doing on our material. And so I'm not overly sold on these rocks quite yet. So what I'm going to do is come back and just play with the scale a little bit. I want to make sure that I crank back. I want to make sure that I crank back the distance on these guys, maybe decrease the smoothing a little bit. And in our levels here, I'm going to just increase our white value as well, just so that we can get these to pop a little bit more, and play around with the gray value too. Just so that we're able to get a little bit more rocks. And I might increase this output here. And so now when we take a look, we can see that our smaller rocks are a little bit darker in value, and that's because they're smaller, they're going to be a little bit flatter or closer to the ground. We don't want them to peak and spike out. So this is looking pretty good. We can also play around with the contrast. And I bump that up all the way to 1 just so that there is a clear cut between the rocks instead of trying to blend them together. And then we can also play around with the height offset, making our big rocks a little bit taller, or we can make our shorter rocks or smaller rocks a little bit taller. And so I'm okay with 0.5. I think that's a pretty good balance there. So we've completed our rocks, and I'm actually just going to go into our small rocks here and bump this up just a little bit, just so we get a little bit less rocks. It was a little too noisy. And we can begin to start providing some edge wear for these rocks. So off of our height blend here, what I want to do is I'm going to add a slope blur grayscale. So I'm going to plug this guy into our top here and steal the output. And so now what I want to do is I want to add a fractal sum base. I'm going to plug this guy into the bottom. Immediately it's going to give us this wackadoo result. And so we can increase the samples. Just want to really increase the intensity here to start getting the shape of our rocks back. And I'm going to go to the min blending mode, and that's going to basically subtract values from our rocks here. Max is going to add some, and you can see that it's starting to add some to the outside geometry of the rocks. And blur is just going to try and blur between the two. So I'm going to use min. I want to subtract some information from this. And I'm going to come into our fractal sum base here. And the first thing I want to do is I want to increase the max level because I want to make it a little bit noisier. I'm also going to increase the opacity. And I'm also going to decrease the roughness. And you can see this is starting to give us a little bit of graininess to these rocks. And I'm going to come back to our intensity and I'm going to do something even lower, something like 0.05. And that's just going to give us some nice surface imperfections in our rocks here. So it's not overly smooth. We still get the overall sense that the rock is pretty smooth, but it's got some little divots in the faces. I'm going to add another slope blur grayscale node because now I want to start taking away larger chunks of the rocks itself. And so with that, I'm going to add a clouds 2 node this time instead of a fractal sum. I'm going to plug this guy in. Again, really ramping up our samples and really decreasing our intensity here. I'm going to go to min. And you can see it's going to start to take away some of our rock faces. And that's kind of the look that I want to go for these guys. However, it's a little bit too intense, so I'm going to do something like 0.1. And even that might be a little bit too intense. Let's try something like 0.0. Let's go 0.05. And that's pretty cool. You can see that we're still getting the smooth area, but it's also eroding away a little bit on the bottom of the rocks there, on the edges. That's looking pretty cool. And now I want to start adding some line cuts right through our rocks, kind of like the rocks have been split open, and I found a little bit of a cool technique to do that. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to add a directional scratches node. And this is going to give us just a whole bunch of these scratches all over the place. But we can actually decrease the scale a little bit. Actually, I might want to keep that on 1 or 2, I guess. We can change the angle of these scratches, and we can also randomly angle them. So this node is pretty powerful, and I use it in a lot of my materials. I'm going to come down to pattern amount, and I really want to decrease the amount of scratches that we have. I also want to just add a little bit of randomness to the length and the width of these scratches. So now that we've got that done, I'm just going to add a blend node onto our erosion. And so when I drag this guy in, all we're going to get is these scratches just sticking out of our mesh. So the first thing I want to do is I want to change our blending mode to subtract. And what subtract is going to do is it's going to take our white values and subtract them from our white values here, resulting in black or darker values. So you can see how it's going to cut through our rocks. Now that's a little bit too man-made and obviously doesn't look realistic, so we're going to alter this a little bit. So what I want to do is I'm going to add a directional warp, and I'm going to plug our scratches into the top input here, and we're going to use this grayscale value from our slope as kind of the gradient input or intensity input of our warp. So we're going to actually use it to warp the scratches so that they kind of curve around the rock like it would naturally. So I'm going to plug this guy in, and nothing is really going to happen yet, but once I turn the warp angle, you can see that it's going to start to take on the shape of our rocks. And if you see here, this is where one of our rocks are, and it's going to use that as kind of a warp. We can also bump this up to like 20 and get some more intense effects. But I think 20 might be a little bit too high. And I'm going to plug this guy in. And you can see now it's going to look a little bit more organic, but it's not quite how I want it. I also maybe want to decrease the scale of, or I guess increase the scale of our scratches here just so that they're a little bit smaller. I'm also going to change our angle random so that they are all kind of a little bit different, and I can also change the uniform angle if I have a different way that I want these to cut across my rocks. That looks a little cool. Add a little bit of angle into our rotation here. And so I'm pretty impressed with the scratches that we've got so far, but they seem a little bit too clear cut and too straight. And I want to mess that up a little bit. So I'm going to use the same technique that we used over here, where I'm going to add a slope blur grayscale. And I'm going to add the clouds 2 node that we have down here into the slope. So again, bumping up our samples, decreasing our intensity. Now we're going to get a little bit more jaggedy scratches, and that's still a little bit too wild, too sharp for me. So we can also change the blending mode to get different looking results. And that's starting to look pretty cool. Getting some nice jagged aspects. So the last thing I want to do is I want to come into our blend, and the subtraction is a little bit too much. So we can just crank down the opacity on this so that they become more superficial cuts into our rocks rather than more profound and deep cuts. And again, we can come back and change the amount if we don't like how little cuts there are. We can also change the scale, the random angle, and really the possibilities for this node are endless. And so we've pretty much almost completed our rocks here, but the last thing I want to do is create a parameter that we're going to be able to expose, and it's going to allow us to just drag a slider back and forth, and it's going to change the amount of the rocks overall on our geometry here, or our material. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use an auto levels, and this is going to pretty much boost up just all of our values here, and it's going to allow us to work again with the full range from black to pure white. And you can see just the difference that it's creating. It's just going to make everything pop a little bit more. So now with that, I'm going to add a blend node, and this node is just going to be put right off to the side there. We're not going to worry about it for right now. So we've got this auto levels, and I want to use a flood fill node. So I'm going to use a flood fill, and what the flood fill is going to allow us to do is it's going to basically find all of these rocks individually, and we're going to be able to kind of isolate them and use any one of these complementary flood fill tools. And what we're going to use is we're going to use the flood fill to random grayscale. And so when I plug that in, you can see that we're going to get a few rocks, but we're not going to get all of the rocks. And the issue is with the flood fill, it needs to be very contrasted as to what the white values are and what the black values are. And you can see because of the nature of our rocks, a lot of them have pretty nice and blended gradients. And so that's not going to bode well for our flood fill here. So what we have to do in between here is we're going to add a histogram scan, and I'm going to bring our position all the way up so that we basically get a black and white mask for our rocks. And you can see now when I click on the flood fill, very subtle, and you might not be able to see it on your screens, but we're going to get the rocks. And when I go to our random, you can see now, boom, we've got all of the rocks that we have in our initial material. So that's perfect. And I want to now take our random grayscale here, and I want to use a node that we're going to be able to cycle through. And basically, I only want to expose one slider or one parameter, and it's going to allow us to just add more or less of our rocks. And so we've already used the node a couple times. We're going to go again with our histogram scan, because we're creating essentially a mask between our blend and a uniform black color. And you'll see that what that's going to do in just a second here. So I'm going to bring up our scan here, and you can see that right now we've got it where there's zero contrast. So when we increase the amount, it's just going to cycle through the values that we have for our random grayscale. The problem with this is that as we cycle through, we get these mid-gray values, and that's going to look really weird in our blend because we're blending with a black color. So we're going to get kind of a pseudo or half rock, and that's not the look that we want to do. We want to just either turn the rocks on or off. So I'm going to bump up our contrast all the way so that as we scale through, the rock is either on or off. And we're going to be able to expose this slider here just to change the amount of rocks that we're going to have on our material. So I'm going to plug in our histogram scan into the opacity of our blend. And I'm going to take our uniform color here, and I'm going to plug that into the top. Now a little bit of a quick optimization tip here. I'm going to take our uniform color, and I'm going to come up to its base parameters. And I'm going to click on this little drop down here, and I'm going to hit absolute. And so we can affect its absolute output size, and you can see that I've got it under here, where right now it's 256 by 256 pixels. And that's a lot of wasted resource on one solid color. So I'm going to drop that down to 16 pixels by 16 pixels, and this is going to allow us to be the most optimized with our uniform color here. So coming back out, you can see that we don't actually have any rocks showing up. And that's because with our histogram scan, we've got all of the rocks as white. And in this case, this instance, white is indicating what we're going to see from the top value. And because black is on top, we're only going to see black in the areas where we have our masked off white, which is our rocks. If I want to see the rocks, I'm going to slowly peel away our position here. And boom, we're going to get all of our rocks showing up. And this mask is going to be perfect for if we want to just remove a hefty amount of rocks while still making sure that we're getting it nice and seamless. All right, so now we're completely done our rocks, and I want to go ahead and start by making the sand. So I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to add a tile sampler, and this is going to be the start for our sand material. So I'm going to come into our sampler here, and I'm going to change our pattern to a paraboloid. I also want to come up to our X and Y amount here, and I'm just going to halve it and bring them down to 8 by 8. As I continue to scroll down, we're going to see our size X and our size Y. So I want to bump up our size X to 10 because I'm going to really stretch it out. And then I'm going to bring this guy down to about 0.65 just to make him very, very thin. Down in our rotation, I'm going to do 45 degrees so that we get a kind of nice and I guess angular. And again, it's still it's still tiling very seamlessly. I'm going to come back up to our position, and I'm going to do our position offset as 0.5. And you can see, well, all that's going to do is just basically shift it over. I'm going to come back down to our rotation random. I'm going to bump that up just slightly. Again, getting a little bit of randomness into our I guess dunes, what we'll refer to them as. And I'm going to come back down to our color. And this is where we're going to basically just randomly color a few of them so that they're going to be different sizes or different heights. And nothing too drastic, maybe 0.3 will be good. So this is going to be the basis of our dunes. I'm going to take this guy and I'm going to add another blur high quality. Again, bring up the quality there and decrease it just so that it's a little bit blurry, but not too much. We just want to get rid of any sharpness. And maybe I'll do 2. The next thing I want to do is I want to add a little bit of arching to our sand dunes to make it look like it's coming to more of a point. And all I'm going to do first off is bring this guy into our outputs here so we can see what we're actually doing. This is what we've got thus far, but I want to make sure that we have a little bit more of a point on our arches here. So I'm going to add a curve node. And the curve node is going to allow us to play around with the gradients of our values here. And so if I double click on our line there, you can see that as I drag this down, we start to get a little bit more of some peaks, some arches there. And you can even see it in our 2D texture here. Whereas if I bring this up and over the curve, I'm going to lighten everything and kind of give it a nice soft fall off. We can think of this point up here as the bright value, or the most bright value in our texture here. And this is going to be the darkest. And so we're playing again with the gradient between those two. So I'm going to bring this down. I'm also going to, if I can grab it, there we go, bring this value down just a little bit. Because I just want to sharpen up our gradients here. All right, and I'm happy with that. So I'm just going to add a histogram range on that guy as well, because I just want to, again, flatten the contrast just a little bit, because I want the arches to be just a little subtle. And so now that we've got our sand, for the most part, started at least, I'm going to start giving it a little bit of random rotation so that it doesn't just look like it's a straight, almost like corrugated cardboard at this point. So I'm going to add a vector warp node. And I want to make sure to plug it into the input there. And so I'm going to take a Gaussian noise. And this is going to be the vector map input. However, you can see that with our Gaussian noise, we have a grayscale output into a color input. And with the vector warp node here, it needs a vector map. And so we can create a vector map using a gradient map node. And you can see that once I do that, it immediately takes effect. But for a traditional vector map, it's actually an orangey and greenish color. So I'm going to take our white here. I'm going to make that kind of like an orange, and I'm going to bring that all the way up. And I'm going to take our black here, and I'm going to bring this down to a kind of like a neon green. And we're going to just essentially simulate or emulate a vector map. And you can see here, all it's done is we've just taken our lighter values and made them orange, and our darker values and made it green. I'm going to come back into our Gaussian, and I'm just going to decrease the scale so that we get more, much larger warps and bends, and change the disorder just a little bit. And I'm going to come into our intensity here on our vector, and I'm just going to decrease that. And so now we're getting a nice looking, nice warp. Again, there's no graininess or anything, and that's one of the benefits of using a vector warp, and it tiles seamlessly. I'm going to do that one more time using another vector warp. And all I'm going to do is duplicate this down here and plug it in. And this time I'm going to make our Gaussian noise a little bit smaller. Again, playing around with the disorder. And I'm going to really crank down the intensity again. Just so that we get a little bit more warping so that it's not silky smooth. And now that we've started our sand, I'm going to go ahead and start blurring out a little bit of areas where maybe sand would lay a little bit flatter so that we're not getting this kind of same pattern, which is going to be very repetitive once we, display it over various tiles. So I'm going to take our vector warp here, and I'm going to just add a non-uniform blur grayscale node. And this is going to allow us to blur it in various areas and not uniformly across the entire texture here. I'll bring this guy out, and I'm going to use a cells 1. I'm going to plug that into our input down there, and you can see that it's immediately going to start working, but that's not how we really want it to look. So I'm going to first decrease the scale so that we get larger cells. I'm going to go about, let's do 3. So we're going to get something like this and play around with the disorder a little bit. And so I'm going to run this through a levels node. And the first thing I want to do with that is I'm going to invert our values. And the way this works is that it's going to blur all of our lighter values. So you can see that as I increase this, it's going to take our lighter areas and blur those out. And you can see it already starting to take effect there. So I'm going to crank our whites back down a little bit because I don't want it to blur that much. I'm also going to take our white output down just a little bit so that we still get a little bit of shape there. And I'll play around with the gray. And then I'm also going to just blur high quality grayscale this as well so that we get a more softer fall off as opposed to these nice sharp points. So I'm going to stick with probably 7. And that's just going to allow us to, again, blur some areas, and we can play around with the disorder if we don't like how it's looking. And lastly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another blend because I want to overlay a little bit of noise into our sand to give it some, a little bit more characteristics to it. So I'm going to add a fractal sum base, and I'm just going to leave it as it is because I like how the noisiness and the different color values are working. So I'm going to plug it in to our blend here. And you can see what it's going to do is just give us a bunch of noise. And I'm going to go down to overlay. And we're going to be able to overlay this over top of our sand to give it, more of a granular look. Except that's a little bit too noisy. So I'm going to bring this opacity way down. Something like 0.2. And now we're starting to get a pretty cool looking sand effect. All right, and so now we've completed our rocks and our sand, and we need to blend them together. So I'm going to add a type blend to the mix here. And because our sand is going to be underneath our rocks in this instance, we're going to take our sand and plug it into our height bottom. I'm also going to take our rocks here and plug it into the top. And I'm going to steal the output here. And I'm just going to plug that guy in. And so instantly you can see that we're getting some rocks showing up over top of our sand, and it's looking pretty cool right now. But we still have a little bit of work to do, like bumping up our contrast here so that it doesn't look like the rocks have this weird gap for some reason in between the sand. We can also play around with the height offset here if we don't like how high our rocks sit on our material. I'm going to leave that at 0.5 for now. And I also want to add a little bit more of just a subtle effect, but it's going to help really sell the material. I want to take these sand dunes that we have and I want to warp them so that they kind of go around the rocks. Because if we're thinking about this from a logical standpoint, the rocks were likely in that spot when the sand kind of blew in and formed these dunes. And so it would make more sense if these dunes actually kind of formed around the rocks. So it's pretty simple to do that. All we need to do is I'm going to add a warp node. And I'm going to plug in our sand in the input because this is what we want to warp. And I'm going to take our rocks here and I'm going to plug this into the gradient input. And because we're going to use this as the tool for which we're going to warp around. And you can see with the initial input, it looks a little bit too noisy and not at all the effect that we want to do. And that's because we need to pretty much gradiate it and push out the values so that the sand is affected on the outside of the rocks. So I'm just going to add another blur high quality grayscale node. And that's going to essentially do just that, where it's going to take our values and push them out and gradiate them. And you can see immediately it's already going to start looking a little bit nicer. You can see here, we've got some rocks and it's taken our sand and just blended it outwards or pushed it out. So we can take this warp and plug this into the bottom. And immediately we're going to get our dunes kind of warping around our sand. So we can play around with the blur to change the quality up, changing the intensity. Again, cranking it down is maybe not the way you want to go. And we can even change the intensity in the warp here too. And that just helps to sell the effect just a little bit nicer. I'm also going to come up to our mask here. And I'm going to decrease the subtraction just a little bit so that we get some more rocks. And you can see that because we've set up our node this way, or our nodes this way, as I add more rocks, the sand is going to automatically warp around the rocks so that we don't have to do any more work. It's just going to organically function the way we intended it to. And so now that we've blended it together, I want to do another cool little trick to kind of help sell the effect of this material. And I want to have a little bit of sand buildup on one side of these rocks, as if the wind has kind of just pushed the sand in and it's kind of collected because it couldn't go past or over the rocks themselves. So again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a blend node and I'm going to take this guy and just plug it into our background there. And I'll just steal this and plug it in. I'm going to take a Gaussian noise and I'm going to plug this in over top. And we're going to use this for the color values of the sand dunes. And I'm just going to really decrease the scale here so that we get very, very subtle effect. Actually, maybe bump that up a little bit more. Play around with the disorder. And in our blend mode, I'm going to go to screen because I only want to keep the lighter values, and you can see what it's doing here. Now I'm sure you're probably wondering how we're going to get it so that we can mask off only one side of these rocks. And there's actually a really handy node that allows us to uniformly blanket only one area of the rocks. And you'll see what I mean here in a sec. So I'm going to use a shadows node. And if I take the height mask of the height blend here, you can see that we're going to get all of the rocks masked off. And so I'm going to take my height mask and plug it into our shadows. And what the shadows is going to do is take all of those values, and it's going to give us just kind of like almost like an ambient occlusion node, the shadows based off of those white values. So you can see that we can change the shadow distance. I'm going to bump that up. I'm going to increase the samples as well. And we can change the direction uniformly. And this is going to be very handy once we start building this mask. So I'm going to go back to 45 degrees. And I'm going to plug this guy into the opacity. Now the problem with this mask so far is that we've got all our white values showing the top node in our blend, which is going to be our Gaussian noise. So essentially what we've done is say, yes, show all of the Gaussian noise around the shadows, but don't show it in the shadows. So ultimately we need to first invert our grayscale so that we're going to get these values, our Gaussian noise values on our rocks here. And you can see it's already starting to kind of take that look, but it's also a little bit too sharp. So I'm going to add a blur high quality grayscale. And I'm just going to increase the intensity there. And that's looking pretty cool. You can see that we're getting a little bit of buildup there. If I come down here and take a look, actually it might be better to show it up here. In our shadows, if I play around with the angle, you can see that we can change the angle that we're going to get. And so we want to match this up with our material. Again, 45 degrees should be an okay angle, as we've already put our dunes here on a 45 degree angle as well. Next, I want to add a little bit more life into our material here, or at least the idea that this material exists in the real world. I'm going to add some bird footprints to kind of help sell that effect. And so I'm going to come over here and add a tile sampler node. I'm going to just push that guy off to the side. I'm going to create a shape node, and I'm going to go to paraboloid. And I just want to scale this guy down on our X here so that it's around, do about 0.15. And so I'm going to Control D to duplicate this. And then I'm going to blend them together. And I want to make sure that I set my blending mode to max so that they're going to kind of intersect with one another. And so with this top guy here, what I want to do is I'm going to add a transformation 2D node. And you can see that when we click on this blend, I'm going to be able to move it around and it's going to intersect nice and clean. Now the problem is that if I move this off, we're going to get it to tiles. So we have to come into our transformation 2D, go into tiling mode and hit absolute. And I'm just going to hit no tiling. So we're not going to run into that issue. So I'm going to scale this guy down just a little bit. I want to make sure that I can get it kind of going off. And actually, I think I'm going to decrease the size on the X even more to about 0.1. And I'm going to do that for the bottom one there too. There we go, looking a little bit nicer. Might also decrease it on the scale there, just so that we can make it fit nice. And so now what I want to do, instead of having to try and mirror that myself on the other side, I'm just going to get a node to do that. And funny enough, it's called mirror grayscale. And all it's going to do is take what we've done over here, and because we've got it set up to mirror the x-axis, it's going to just mirror it across the other side. And so now you can see that we've got this nice little bird footprint here. I'm going to move these guys over here so we have more space. And I'm going to take the blend and I'm going to plug that into our pattern input. So now when I come into our tile sampler and I go to pattern input, we have a lot of these tiny little bird feet all around our material, or at least in the texture so far. So with this, I'm going to add a blend. Bring these guys up over top here. And I'm going to plug this guy in over top so that we get our nice little bird feet. And I'm going to go to our blend node here. And I'm going to subtract these from our sand. And you can see that it's going to start to eat away from all of the material underneath it. But we're running into the issue where these bird feet are actually cutting through our rocks. And so one way to fix that, it's pretty simple. We can just come back to where we have our height mask here. We can take this guy and plug it in. And then all we need to do is add an invert grayscale node. And so this is going to allow us to say, hey, put the bird feet anywhere that's white, but don't touch the rocks. It's also a little bit too cut in. We've got a pretty chunky and hefty bird stepping on the beach sand here if he's making these big indents. So I'm going to decrease the opacity pretty significantly. We do 0.1. And that's looking pretty cool. I want to add a little bit more variety now to these bird feet. So I'm going to come into our tile sampler, play around with the scale. Maybe actually decrease these a little bit more, get some tiny bird feet. Play around with the position random. Have some rotation random. We also want to maybe mask a few off and color them random so that some subtract less and some subtract more from the sand. And that's looking pretty cool. And that's a start. I want to add a little bit more variety to it because right now you can see that it feels pretty one directional, like it's all going straight that way. So on top of our tile sampler here, I'm going to add a swirl grayscale node. And you can see what it's going to do is just pretty much what it says in the name, just swirl our textures here. So I'm going to add or ×2 on our texture so that it covers the entire feet of the bird. And I'm going to come down to amount and I'm just going to drastically reduce that so that it's not super strong, but it's just swirly enough to give a sense of different direction. And lastly, I want to just add another non-uniform blur grayscale node because I want to start to blur out some of these so that they don't all look cookie cutter and pretty much stamped on our material, right? Over time, sand would kind of fall back into these footprints and wash over them. So I want to try and mimic that. So again, what I'm going to do is just add a Gaussian noise. I'm going to increase the scale on that. Actually, I think increase the scale, decrease the amount. Play around with the intensity just slightly. Bring that down. And I want to make sure that I increase my samples and my blades. I'm probably going to bring the intensity right down to 1. Just so that they blur in a little bit nicer and they don't look like, again, they've been stamped on. And I think they're a little bit too sharp again still, so I'm going to decrease the subtraction opacity to about 0.05. And that just adds a little bit of a different effect.